This is a 750 SS 1993 gold frame black wheels, and I'm going to run through idle mixture setting on one of these. It has the standard Mikuni carbs. It's been sitting for a long time. I've gone through them. It's got brand new pilot jets in it, 37.5. Float levels have been set, all that sort of stuff, so it should be a pretty good basis. And the way the idle mixture screws work on these isn't really what a lot of people expect. If you're used to old Delordos, you might expect to see a turn and a half out pretty consistently. Some of the, like the Sport 11 Gutsy carbs, they're 3 turns out, but they're pretty standard. That's what people expect. These carbs just don't work like that. You end up usually with a lot more turns out, and you don't get the distinction between too lean and too rich that you do on most carbs. Certainly you get a too lean, but the too rich doesn't really happen. You just keep winding the idle mixture screws out and it doesn't ever really stop running fairly well. So we'll go through the gas analyzer from fully closed and just come out in maybe half turn increments and let the gas analyzer stabilize, and then go from there and just get a feel for how many turns out they need to be. And often the way they vary, the mixture is not very linear at all. Before I get started on the carb mixture setting, I'll just run through the adjustment points on the carbs themselves. Mikuni BDST 38s, these are off a 2001 400 Monster. So they have the electronic heaters, and the float bowl passages are not drilled and tapped as they are in earlier ones, and typically one of them's got the end broken off it. These are off a crashed bike. So when we're adjusting these carbs, the screws we're going to be using are the idle speed screw, which is this screw here. And this screw, you just wind it in to raise the idle speed and out to lower the idle speed. And it's just there. On the bike, the carbs sit like so, and it's often hidden behind this plastic hose. But that is your idle speed screw. The idle mixture screws are these little brass screws here and here. They are a fuel screw. So you screw them in or clockwise to lean the mixture, and screw them out or anti-clockwise to richen the mixture. And almost nearly all the way in. There you go. From memory, this bike was a bit strange. I think I worked on it once before it got crashed. Yeah, they're a bit different. Usually I would have these sort of out on a 400, 2 to 3 turns, on 750s and 900, sort of 4 to 5 to 6, depending on the bike, what it wants. And the float level can make quite a difference. I had a 900 recently that I pulled the carbs off and redid. I think prior to that I had 1 cylinder, the screws were 2 turns out, and the float was about 10 mil height above the flat surface. I reset the float to 12 mil, which is where I like to set them, and it went from 2 turns out to about 5 turns out from memory. So the float level can have quite an impact on the idle mixture screw setting. So that's your idle mixture screws there, and you just wind them out as required. I would recommend, if you can, is wind them out all the way out. Pop it out, there's a spring. There is also a little steel washer in there, and underneath the steel washer is an O-ring. But I like to pull these out, put some anti-seize on the thread liberally, and then put it back in again, because they can seize in, and once they seize in, it's a real mess. So that's what I like to do with idle mixture screws. Now, some people will tell you that the idle speed screw is down between the carbs, and there's a monster Facebook group I'm on, which I must say is probably the worst I've ever come across of bad info. But the screw down between the carbs, between the throttles, this one here is the balance screw, or if you're American, synchronization screw. And what it does, it adjusts the relationship between the 2 throttle blades. Now, if you adjust this screw, it will change the idle speed, because if you wind it one way, it will open this throttle compared to this one, because the idle speed screw is on this throttle. If you wind it one way, it'll open this throttle here. If you wind it the other way, it'll close this throttle. So it will impact the idle speed, but it is not the idle speed adjustment, and if you mess with it, it may make it run really badly. Years ago at Moto 1, we had a bike come in, a 900 Super Sport, that was running on one cylinder, and it had fuel and it had spark and compression, and everything was fine, but it wouldn't run on one cylinder, and the plug was black and wet from memory. It didn't make any sense. It just would not run on one cylinder. And I was at the point of starting to pull it apart, and I thought, I'll just check the balance, just stupidly, because, you know, check the simple stuff, and it was way out of balance. And I adjusted the balance screw here to bring it back into balance, and it was fixed. So what happens is, if this throttle here, which is on the idle stop, adjusted by this screw, if that's at its normal setting and you wind this out, so this throttle shuts completely, then there's no air getting through this side. And because there's no air, it'll still suck fuel through the idle ports, or the pilot circuit, and it'll just make the plug wet and it won't run. And no matter what you do, open the throttle up, it doesn't make any difference, it won't run. And there's a guy on one of the forums I'm on recently who had a bike that was displaying exactly that symptom. And we said to him, just check the balance, it sounds like it's out of balance. And he just wouldn't. And the thread went on for 15 pages of him refusing to do simple things without fixing it. So that's one thing you really need to be aware of. Do not adjust this unless you have a set of vacuum gauges or some other synchronization balancing tool on it. And if you do adjust it and it starts to be really weird, go back to where you were. And the second thing to be aware of is this spring here just sits between this throttle arm and this one, or the end of this screw. And people often pull these carbs apart to clean them all out, separate them, and they lose that spring. When you put it back together, it is massively out of balance and it will only run on one cylinder. I've had a couple of people do that locally in the last couple of years. So if you're pulling them apart, make sure you catch that screw as it comes out and then put it back in when you put them back together. It looks like this has actually been adjusted all way one way. So I'll just wind it in and you can see the adjustment moving, and you can probably see this throttle opening a whole lot and this one not moving at all, which is a little bit strange. And now it's actually off the idle stop. So something's a bit strange with this one. I did work on this bike once before it got crashed, and it was, from memory, a little bit weird in its carb setup. You can see now that this one is just moving a little bit, and it's almost, the balance screw is almost all the way out. But now this one is sitting on the idle stop again, which is down in there. And that's the idle speed screw down there. So when you're playing with these things, adjust your idle speed, your idle mixture, and if you have vacuum gauges or some other synchronization tool, adjust the cylinder sync. Now, if no one ever adjusts the cylinder sync, generally it will be fine forever. We used to check it every service. It was very, very rare you would do anything to the balance on these bikes. They were always fine. It doesn't make much difference. It's not like an old Delorto where you've got two cables and the cables, pull at different rates and you can hear them when they're out of balance. These ones, you can't really hear it, and if it's really out of balance, it'll just run on one cylinder. So that's the main things you need to be aware of when you're adjusting these carbs. It's up on the gas analyzer. This is the CO, which is the number we're going to look at. We're sort of aiming for about 5 to 5.5% on one of these. Other numbers, hydrocarbons, which tells you how much unburnt fuel there is. Oxygen, which tells you how much unburnt air there is. If these numbers are high, it means it's not running particularly well. That's the CO2, which we don't really worry about. So I'll fire it up, and then I think mixture screws are about 5 turns out now. I'll wind them all the way in, and then we'll start coming out and just watch the idle mixture as the screws come out. So I'll just wind the screws all the way in, and you'll hear the difference in the engine note. As you can tell now, it's running on 1 cylinder because the idle mixture screws all the way in. They were 4 turn, that screw was 4 turns out. There's still some fuel in there, 1.2% CO, but it's really not very happy. And the oxygen certainly shows that. So I'll wind it out half a turn at a time. We'll see how it changes. That's 1 turn out. One and a half turns out. Two turns out. Two and a half turns out. Three turns out. Three and a half turns out. Four turns out. turns out. Five and a half turns out. Six turns out. Six and a half turns out. And seven turns out. And you can see now the hydrocarbons and the oxygen are really climbing. That just means it's getting really dirty. It's not combusting very well because it is too rich. But the engine note certainly hasn't gotten bad, it hasn't fallen over way too rich. So what I'll do is I'll wind them back in maybe 2.5 turns and see how it cleans up, because sometimes going back in again you don't get the same result as you had when you were coming out. We're back to 4.5 turns out. And you can see the hydrocarbons dropping and the oxygen dropping because the engine's a bit happier. We're down back to about 5.5%. This engine's got about 85,000 Ks on it, so maybe the valves aren't sealing that great anymore. That's why there's more hydrocarbons and more oxygen than I would normally expect. Well, that's 4.5 turns out, about 5.5%. That's about what I want. The vertical's currently about 5 3/4 turns out. We'll wind it in a turn and see what happens. One turn in on the vertical, a little bit too lean at that. I'll bring it out. Oh, it's going quite lean. That's one turn difference, and you can see how fast it responds. It's still 4.5 turns out or so. Back out half a turn on the vertical one. That's about where it wants to be. So that's over 5 turns out. So we're both in the region of 4.5, 5 turns out. This cylinder's cleaner, hydrocarbons are lower, oxygen's lower. So the valves are sealing a little bit better on this cylinder, I'd say, and the rings are working better. They do move around a bit at times. I think this engine's a little bit, maybe a little bit ratty. So that sort of gives you an idea of how much the idle mixture varies on these and how far out the screws really need to be. We'll go back in 1/4 on that one and see if it cleans it up a little bit. It's back under 5%. That's how sensitive they can be. That's a 1/4 turn and it's gone from 5.5 back to 4. come back out 1/8 of a turn and see what happens with just that small adjustment. So that small adjustment is more like what you would expect to see on a Delauto, but it wouldn't be at 5 turns out, it would be between 1 turn and 1 1/4, or 1 1/4 and 1 1/2. It's quite bizarre that it was already 5 1/2 turns out, and that extra quarter makes all the difference, or extra 1/8 of a turn makes all the difference.